So we're going to talk about colonized futures today. And I have a question mark here because we can have a discussion about whether our futures really are colonized or whether we can do anything to stem the trajectory that is based on history and based on our presence. So first, I'm going to introduce the idea of colonialism and what coloniality is. It's distinct from colonialism. And then we'll talk about what that means for futures. So thinking about the way our imaginations are clipped by coloniality, the role of technology in colonizing futures, and the very concept of conquering the future in general. And then we'll do an activity and a discussion to get into these topics deeper. So what does coloniality mean? This is first, for those of you who are not even familiar with colonialism, a very quick rundown of the history of how European nations colonized the world. Right, so you can see how over time, at some point, nearly every country in the world had been colonized, and then they gained independence over time. But what does that really mean? What does that independence mean? So decoloniality has to do with this idea that even after countries gained their independence from European colonial powers, Western hegemony did not end. That continued even after their actual political control over these countries ended. And so coloniality represents this idea of the ongoing domination all over the world, even after they've given up control of the lands. And so instead of global colonialism, as we saw on that map at its peak, we now have global coloniality. And a lot of this comes from papers that I assigned in my class, and I'm happy to share them, the papers, the sources, if anybody wants, just email me. So colonialism is not the same as coloniality, and that means decolonization is not the same as decoloniality. Decolonization has to do with gaining independence from a colonial power, repatriation of land, and that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking more about that idea of global hegemony of the West and what that means for not just countries that were formerly colonized, but even those who had never been colonized before. It's a global phenomenon. And so you might see terms like post-colonial and decolonial, and some people use them interchangeably, but I like this kind of approach that says post-colonial suggests that coloniality ended, that we're living in a post-colonial world, but decolonial acknowledges that it has an ongoing impact and we still need to work to dismantle it. And a lot of theorists refer to what is called the colonial matrix of power. So I'm going to explain what that is. It's basically in several intersectional hierarchies that affect all dimensions of social existence. And those hierarchies include economy, labor, race, gender, religion, epistemology, language, art. Almost every domain you can think of as part of our lived experience is governed by the colonial matrix of power. For example, certain types of labor, like manual labor, are disparaged, and intellectual labor is considered more valuable. Or in other ways, the white race is determined to be preferred and is given more power and domination, and other races are subjugated, and so on. Like, you can look at any one of these aspects and find the ways that Western value systems and Western approaches dominate including epistemology, including the way we think about art, like the idea of primitive art is an example of that. Languages, the way almost all universities around the world use English as the dominant language, at least non-European world. So that's what the colonial matrix of power is. And it's the means by which the West maintains its power and control. And some of the other ways this shows up are in these dichotomies of East, West, primitive, civilized, magic, mythic versus scientific, irrational versus rational, traditional versus modern, Europe and not Europe. And coloniality is enacted through this colonial matrix of power. And a lot of these judgments were made hegemonic by the late 19th century, meaning they're dominant and all pervasive, almost impossible to avoid. And this colonial matrix of power was globalized and exported by colonial expansion as the hegemonic criteria to racialize, classify, and pathologize the rest of the world's population. So this is the way every society in the world is judged and placed in a kind of hierarchy. And at the top is always the Western values. And the impacts of this are significant because it erases different ways of being and knowing, meaning ontologies and epistemologies. Because if you're always trying to achieve this Western preference, Western standard, then other ways of being and knowing are erased. And they're not valued as much, and eventually they disappear because they are not considered worth really existing anymore in light of Western power. So it advantages the West and imposes a particular viewpoint on the entire world, meaning it homogenizes and flattens. And we see that with globalization. Almost anywhere you go in the world anymore, you can very easily navigate airports, roads, because they're all based on one particular model and blueprint. And so there's a kind of global homogenizing of cultures and worldviews. And as Mignolo, who's another decolonial theorist, writes, it establishes the current world order because they do have the power and they do have the influence, and so they're able to establish the world order. And this, Mignolo argues, the colonial matrix is the foundational structure of Western civilization. It is the means by which Western civilization is able to exist in its current form. And it produces a dominant hegemon, which is like the power that profits, and a subjugated subaltern, which is the subjugated group that is exploited. So the hegemon is generally considered to be the West or the global North, and the subaltern is the East or the global South. And the subaltern is what enables the hegemon to exist in its dominant form. And this is a really good video that illustrates that point. So the hegemon and the subaltern produce one another. This was produced by a Turkish artist, and he's juxtaposing these, the hegemon and the subaltern, or the West and the East, in this video. going to stop it there, but I think you get the point that the images from the industrialized West with a high standard of living would not be possible without these other very, very impoverished, kind of sad, war-torn places that enable the West to be what it is. Oops. Okay. So what does all of this have to do with futures? Let's talk about that now. So the first was, like I said, the idea of clipped imaginations. And this comes from Frantz Fanon, the Wretched of the Earth. He's probably the most well-known decolonial theorist. He's from Martinique. And he wrote a lot about the psychology of the colonized societies and what it means to be in a post-colonial world or a post-independence world. And so he himself was a psychiatrist. And so he talks about how colonization limits our imaginations, because in our kind of rejection of the West, after you've gained independence, you want to restore your country to its past glory. That, however, means that you're also restoring terribly sterile cliches as a banal quest for the exotic. So it becomes kind of a fetishization of your own culture, because these countries have been colonized for hundreds of years, and so much knowledge, so much culture is lost. And in trying to regain that, they're basically just kind of mimicking their past rather than being able to think creatively about the future. And they're using techniques in a language borrowed from the occupier. And this can also be interpreted to mean that they're thinking about themselves objectively as an outsider now, because they're trying to discover, kind of as an anthropologist would, what they were like before. So that kind of distorts their image of themselves. And so there's no real creativity, no ebullience. And also in trying to restore a past, they become irrelevant to the present. And so they're not able to affect real transitions or change or like effective, have the kind of impact on the world that they desire to, because they're constantly reflecting back on the past. At the same time, Ashish Nandi, who's an Indian scholar, he talks about the idea of idolization and mimicry. So centuries of colonization plus an idolization of the West as the standard that needs to be achieved leads the formerly colonized to mimic their colonizers. And so the futures that they imagine for themselves are a mimicry of what they see in the West now. So for example, a society in Africa might be looking at France, who are their colonizers, and say, wow, look how industrialized they are, look at their standard of living, that's what we need to achieve. Maybe we can have that in the future. So their future is not authentic, and it's not true to their own culture or society necessarily. It's a mimicry of something else, and a present, not even a future vision. It's a present that they're trying to reach. So it robs the subaltern of an authentic future vision. And because we're at CMU, I thought it was worth talking about the role of technology. And this comes from Ziauddin Sardar. Some of you futurists might be familiar with him. He's a polymath, so he delves in a lot of different topics, but he's also a futurist. And this paper is actually from 1998, so you'll see the language is a bit dated, but it's interesting to see how he foresaw this in 1998. And he's talking about how the internet or technology at large is a creation of the West and a monolithic entity dominated by the West. And he sees it as an extension of the Western will to power. So this was when the internet was just starting to proliferate, and the same way European power dominated the world, he saw the internet and the way the internet is structured as a way of imposing Western domination, Western ways of thinking. And so the internet and technology become another way to homogenize the future. And we see that too, where anywhere in the world you go now, everybody has a cell phone. The internet is ubiquitous pretty much, and it really has taken over the world. And because of that, because we see only one way of living in the world, they're unable to imagine any other future outside of the internet or outside of Western technology. And he writes that the net is a major instrument by which the future is defined in the image of the West. There is an inbuilt Western momentum that is taking us towards a single determined future. In this Eurocentric vision of the future, technology is projected as an autonomous and desirable force. This self-perpetuating momentum has locked us in a linear, one-dimensional trajectory that has actually foreclosed the future for the non-West. An illusion of accelerated movement is produced to create an illusion of inevitability. So some things I wanted to highlight here is this idea of a single determined future and a one-dimensional trajectory. Again, this idea that there's no other way that we can imagine futures outside of the internet and technology. And how this forecloses in the authentic future vision of the non-West, because to do otherwise would be, seems like you're not really progressing, you're regressing in some way, or you're not following the standard ways of what progress and development look like. And that's also that it's an autonomous and desirable force. Like, to choose otherwise doesn't make sense. Like, it seems like it's the only option. And so it also seems like it's inevitable. Like, can there even be another way of moving into the future outside of the internet? And then he writes, the West was not just in history, it is remade in the present and reconstructed in the future, particularly on and by the internet. At each stage, it is internalized more and more and becomes an integral part of the global consciousness. As such, the future has been colonized by the West, and if the net continues to function in its current structure, it will enhance the Western colonization of the future. So the future has been colonized by the West, and the internet facilitates that. And maybe you disagree, and that's fine, and that's something we can maybe talk about afterwards. This final paper I thought was very interesting. It's from Barbara Adam, History of the Future, and she's basically talking about the ways our conception of the future have changed over time. So she says that our idea of the future is influenced by Western modernity, because traditionally the future was determined by fate, the role of the gods, or it was cyclical, and people had these different ways of thinking about time in the future. But now with modernity, the future is an empty domain of control, just like land, just like resources. It's like whoever gets there first gets to control what happens. And she writes, divorced from context, the future can be exploited anywhere, at any time, and for any circumstance. As open realm of potential, it practically requires shaping and making. It becomes a task for planning. Imagined as an abstract, empty territory, it is amenable for colonization and control, plunder and pillage. Devoid of content and meaning, it is a realm destined to be filled with our desire. And I think this is an important thing for futurists to think about, is like, are we colonizing the future? Is it like a race to who gets there first and who gets to decide what our futures look like, especially in this globalized world where whoever dominates kind of sets the tone for the entire world? So I think this is a really important point. And she also talks about this idea of future taking, and how when we think about the future as an empty resource space, and again, like, it's something that needs to be taken, needs to be conquered first. And she also talks about the ways the past limits our present and restricts our futures. And we kind of see that now with the way a lot of people, these multinational corporations were completely disregarded the effect that they had on the environment. And now we're living those consequences. And younger generations might not even have a future, which is very scary. So that's the idea of the past actions limiting our present and also restricting our futures. So every deliberate future making inevitably involves future taking. So one person's control or domination of the future is taking control away from others. It prefigures and shapes successors' future present. So the decisions that we're making now about the future are going to be imposed on future generations. They won't have a choice in it. They might not like it, might not be something they choose, but because we chose it, they just have to kind of live with it. So we need to recognize that our responsibility to those unknown others, those future generations, and act responsibly. And she says, despite all this, we still hold on to the same illusion, still live the same make-believe. The future is empty and open, we say. It is ours to forge and shape to will, ours to colonize with treasured belief systems and techno-scientific products of the mind, ours to traverse, ours for the taking. I think this is very interesting how she linked the idea of the way we think about the future with colonization, how the conquest of time is parallel to the conquest of land. And it's kind of a mindset of conquest that we've inherited from years of colonization. So in sum, colonization broke ties to these alternate cosmologies, ways of thinking, being, and doing, and limiting our imaginaries to this Western hegemon. Also, this idea that globalization is essentially Americanization, because these powerful technologies that shape global networks are American innovations, such as Google, Facebook, and they're dominated by American corporations. And our conceptions of the future as a dominion of control lie in modern Western concepts of time and conquest. So that's important to keep in mind when thinking about how we design for futures and how we plan for futures. Are we just thinking about it in terms of Western conquest? And also, the world is ever more Eurocentric, with Eurocentric systems and ideals constituting the daily lives of people around the globe. For those of you familiar with futures, I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of multiple futures, that there shouldn't just be one. But because Eurocentrism or coloniality, I guess I should say, is nearly ubiquitous, it doesn't really allow for those other futures to emerge in a coherent and authentic and effective way. Like they're easily buried under the other narratives. But even with all of these challenges, the future can't be ignored. And this is Ashish Nandi again saying, by silencing other people's visions, you ensure the hegemony of yours and can sell, even to some of the oldest civilizations of the world, your culturally limited social and political ideals as some of the immutables of our times. By avoiding thinking about the future, you hand over the future as a prisoner to the presently dominant political economy and to unthinking, docile professionals and academic bureaucrats. So there are two parts to this statement. One is that those who have the power shouldn't be silencing other people's visions. And then the other part is that those who are subjugated, who are part of the subaltern, you can't just hand it over and say, well, what power do we have against against the very powerful West? Because you're essentially handing over your future then too. So Fanon and Sardar call for a delinking from the West when it comes to decolonizing futures. They say we need alternative visions, alternative futures, and that the subaltern is the source of those alternative approaches, because there are pockets still of ideas that have not been introduced to the West. And again, the environment is a great example of that. There are so many societies who know how to live sustainably and in symbiosis with the land. And so they can be a source of alternative approaches to thinking about the environment. And Sardar also says, and this is where the question comes of, are our futures colonized? He says, the future is the only arena that can provide us with enough space to be different, to be other than the West. So the present is what it is, but maybe we can change the future and ensure that our futures are not colonized in the same way our present has been. And he writes, the real meaning of dissent is to keep the future open. I think the sole function for breaking ranks is to defy and subvert the inevitable in the future. So again, this idea that we do not have to go along with this trajectory of coloniality that has been going on for hundreds of years, it doesn't have to be inevitable, and what can we do to break that, stem that tide? So that's what I have. Any questions? Questions? Thoughts?